This is
In the Middle of It,
a podcast about
participation culture in Aotearoa.
Join us out in the field as we try to discover what it takes to grow participation culture in communities in Aotearoa.
Oh, I can see how this is going to work on the streets. I can see what this will do and how this will benefit a community.
variety is the spice of life.
You have to be open to exploring and experimenting and listening and seeing how a theory actually comes alive in a unique context.
Welcome back to In the Middle of It. I'm Sissy Rock.
I'm Duncan Matthews.
I'm Lucy Mary Mulholland.
Last time on In the Middle of It, we were talking about participation culture and the things that Duncan and Lucy Mary and myself identified that made us very attracted to it. And we're here in episode 3.
Episode 3.
Which I've been calling Out of Our Heads and Onto the Streets. Well, when you hear that, what comes up for you?
I think for me it's that really taking the theory and applying it is actually getting out and experimenting, which of course as soon as you get out into the streets, it's going to be different in every street and every different place. You can't really predict what's going to happen. You have to be open to exploring and experimenting and listening and seeing how a theory actually comes alive in a unique context.
Yeah, I think for me it's about when does the funding application go onto the streets, quite literally. I've written my fair share of funding applications, including for this one. And once you see it in real life, there's a saying, no plan survives contact with the real world. But yeah, that's what I think.
And I guess for me and you, we've spent a long time with the ideas in our heads on paper, iterating, trying to shape it to a way that would be attractive to a funder, because it took us a few attempts.
Yes.
And then that iterative process has really fermented inside our minds and we're pretty ready. And then, Lucy Mary, you come along and you've kind of got to catch up or get in the groove. I mean, what was it like for you when you read the funding application?
It was pretty exciting, I guess. It was very inspiring. I think what I liked about it is, you could tell it was really well put together for the funders, but it felt real, like it was written by real people who've been out there doing this kind of mahi. I think that it had a groundedness to it, as well as being quite aspirational, which I liked.
I mean, Duncan, you wrote it. What was in your mind when you're holding the pen?
How can I turn Sissy's ideas into something with logic?
Are my ideas not logical?
No, there's that piece of we have ideas, we know it's going to work in community, but you have to write them down and articulate them in a way that other people with their degrees or with their computer screens or with their research can see and feel what you just described, Lucy Mary, in terms of, I can see how this is going to work on the streets. I can see what this will do and how this will benefit a community.
How did you guys come up with a proposal that gave enough trust and confidence to the funders, but allowed you guys enough scope to be able to play and experiment and let there be unknown within?
Part of me wants to say that was the gift of participatory cities. You know, it had evidence, it had a framework, so we knew it was something we could riff off, but we also had our own reputation in Aotearoa, so we needed something to kind of back that up, but our reputation was, I think, one of being able to take ideas and turn them into actions that are appropriate for where we're living.
I think what we were able to do is bring together like the trust that particularly Sissy has, but Community Think and Neighbours Aotearoa as practitioners of community-led development, together with the trust of the participatory city model and the growing awareness and acceptance that traditional models of counting widgets, counting people, counting events, having strict outcomes that you have to report against that hasn't really achieved what central or local governments have wanted it to achieve for the last 4 years and 40 years, and people are ready for something different. And that growing acknowledgement as well of alternative worldviews, alternative ways of doing things, which have strong results and strong positive outcomes for people.
But it's an and. We're not saying we're better than
No,
or
not
we're
at all.
replacing. And I hope that came through in the proposal, that we saw this as another approach to complement a variety of approaches, like variety is the spice of life, right? Something like that.
And I think actually our special sauce this year is that we were up for a challenge and something a bit less certain. It's very easy to put together a funding application where you know you're going to be able to deliver something, or you can guarantee that you can tick that box, which said I did 100 things. But when you're a little bit less certain or a little bit unsure what the shape will be, what the emotional toll will be, how many times you're going to have to get in the car and drive up the road, that's something which we're uniquely up for.
Let's see if we're still up for that at the end of this.
Yes.
I actually caught up with Marten from the DIA recently, and we kind of relived that moment that we had coffee together. And of course I recorded it. So do you want to have a listen?
Yeah. Let's see what Marten has to say.
I'm Marten Schievink. I'm a senior advisor with the Department of Internal Affairs. I work in strategic programs and partnerships, and one of the roles that I have is managing the community-led development program. I've been in the department since 2008.
Thank you for joining us, Marten. We just thought you were one of the people that helped shape the approach that we're taking, and we really appreciate, working with the Department of Internal Affairs. And I thought, would it be okay if you let us know what you think community development actually means in communities?
I think the word community development is not necessarily a term that everyone in the community would use. So I think you've got people that are volunteers that go down and tidy up the beach. And would they call that community development, or would they call that I'm just volunteering and doing something good for my community? And then you go through to the quite formalized, structured community development approaches. I think you've got the spectrum of those that are just doing stuff in their community and doing a great job of helping out and being neighborly and volunteering, to those that are quite structured and formal, and this is the way we do it, and we are quite intentional about community development and what we would like to see.
Have you seen an evolution of community-led development as a idea?
I know internally in the department we've changed, because we realised that community come in all different shapes. We need to take more of a come as you are approach, rather than trying to force people into a model. And so when you try to force people into a model, it does all sorts of strange things to a community. It squeezes them out in a completely different way and morphs them into something that's not natural to them. And so I think sometimes we have a model and a structure in our head, which then we try to overlay and say, well, this is best practice and good practice, but it doesn't fit for the community that we're working in. I think if you use quite a structured approach and community-led, then you miss the margins and miss the broadness of what community-led looks like, rather than being quite formulaic in an approach.
So what was it that piqued your interest about participation culture?
We've seen, perhaps in the last, since I was a kid, a rapid change in culture and society, and moving from a one income family to everyone has to work, no one has time. You just don't have time for actually connecting with your neighbours. I remember when I was a kid, my neighbourhood all knew each other. We all ran as kids in and out of each other's houses. My parents didn't worry about breakfast, lunch. It was, you're going to get it somewhere in the community at some point in time. I don't think we'll ever go back to that, but there is a need to be able to be connected in our community and participate in our community and be involved in some way that gives us a sense of belonging, I think. And for me, the wanting to help and to understand how we can be better connected. And I run across so many fascinating things in my work of examples of how not to do things. And we're all part of a community, and so some of this fits into that IAP2 model of participation spectrum in terms of should we inform people or consult or engage or try to collaborate or empower people, even with local government and central government, which is, where I work, using models like that don't actually move to empower. That's not really where we sit. We want to kind of move to and involve people in decision making and then just go and do it.
Even if neighbours are just saying hello and something about the street with each other, it's helping them that you're no longer alone. You're in a bigger kind of social unit than yourself. And I just think that helps.
Yeah, and I think we miss the opportunity to invite. There's this power of invitation. Often people don't necessarily come because they're not invited. I've got this example that I use. The area I live in has 2 parks. So the council decided that they would do an upgrade of the big park. I was in a forum with the council that they were telling us how they did it, and somehow I got in the parks and recreation think tank kind of space and was talking about it. And so they talked to me about all this group about how they went about doing this new park. And I realized that every mechanism they used went around me.
Right.
So they said, we put it in the local newspaper, which I don't read. They put it on the local TV, which I don't watch. They put it in all of these things, which I didn't actually do. So they completely went around me. And the easiest thing was put something in my letterbox, because I actually go to that every day to check. And my kids use that park. And so they did all this consultation. I said, I guarantee after all your consultation, you're going to do this rope thing like this, and you're going to put some rubberized mat underneath it, and you're going to do this, and that will be it. And sure enough, that's exactly what they came up with. And I says, I didn't need to consult to get exactly the same thing as what you did out over there.
Yeah.
Is what you've put here, because you've already got the designs. But if you truly wanted me to be involved and make this my part and made this a wonderful family event, you would have told me, we're dropping the wood chips off on this day, bring your wheelbarrow. And me and my kids would have come over, we would have done that, and we would have had a picnic, and we would have created community.
I thought it was interesting, the bit that Marten said about, how did he say it? Things are going around him, like invites to be engaged aren't coming to him, they're going around him. And I guess that's one of the things that we really wanted to get right, get clear about, is on the ground, having people who knew how to build relationships and get to people who weren't going to rely on social media or flyer drops, but were actually going to build a network of relationships. That meant that, information was getting out there and people were sharing it with each other.
A bit like a telephone tree, hey? That old kind of
Yeah.
so-and-so shares it with them, and then they share it with 3 other people, and spreads through the relationships.
And was that in your mind when you were thinking about the sorts of people we wanted to be weavers?
Yeah, I think so. I think there was definitely that feeling of people that are not afraid to get out from, behind the computer and doing that kind of digital communication, and actually up for going and saying hi to a stranger on the street and chatting with parents at the school gate, and really building that face-to-face communication.
Well, we recruited these people using what we're terming relational recruiting, which is something that we've addressed in.
That's how we found Lucy Mary as well.
That's how we found Lucy Mary. So using the telephone tree, hey, this is what we want, reaching out. And then we've got weavers on the ground now that we're thinking will be doing a similar thing.
Yeah, I think that's the hope, and that they're continuing to sort of nurture those relationships, and it's sort of 2 ways, right? They're not just sort of communicating out, but they're listening through what's filtering through the neighbourhood, and in terms of what they're hearing people are up for, and where there are opportunities, and where there are those little gaps that they can just kind of weave their way through.
And, we I think have been trying to identify principles to help the weavers in their work. And so this principle kind of is relationship before ideas. Like me and you, I remember sitting in a room and kind of thinking, oh, that's what's happening. Lots of ideas come, and then we try and coalesce relationships around them. What we're trying to do is get people out and have relationships and see what ideas emerge.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And we talk about this a lot, right? Like the magnet of the ideas is like, we feel like once we've got an idea, then we can convince someone and then we're going to rally a whole group of people around to make it happen. But actually, what we find is, often those things fizzle out, or it takes one person to really drive it and sort of convince everyone else. But then there's not that kind of sense of shared will and energy.
Well, you have to do a whole lot of work to create the group around the idea that we talked about in last episode, as opposed to when the relationships are already there, the idea flourishes within that.
Yeah, I think about like dinner parties, where you're all sitting around having dinner and then you come up with this great idea together that you're all into because you all know each other and you're all relating. And that vibe and the energy and the ease with what that happens. Yeah. And I think that's what we're trying to create, the conditions that will allow ideas to come up with ease, and a variety of ideas, and some of them might take off and some of them might not. And we're hoping that our weavers have a mix of skills and attributes that will allow that to happen.
But it takes quite a lot of trust though, hey, of like, I think being a weaver and going out there without a plan, in a way, without an idea to sort of lead you, but just having those organic conversations and waiting for the ideas to pop out of those relationships. I think it's quite brave in a way, Yeah,
is it countercultural?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is.
I was just thinking that as well. It's quite odd in Western culture to go out there for the purpose of creating relationships rather than promoting an idea or getting buy-in for an idea or finding out what the ideas are.
I remember when I worked at Waitakere City Council, and maybe just as we're moving into the super city or around that time, there was this sort of notice came out like, less cups of tea please, more work, less tea drinking. And I thought, I think that was the thing that made working out in Waitakere and West Auckland so special, was that there was time to go out and have cups of tea and build relationships and hear what was happening. So when the work came, like the tangible results, they came quite quickly because all of the stretchy, elastic and trust was already there.
So, Sissy, you've had a relationship with Marten from the DIA for how many years? Many years.
7, 10?
7 years.
Yeah.
So Marten obviously trusts you, has a good relationship. Why do you think he bought into this idea of the participatory city?
I think Marten's really been across the community-led development approach since the beginning. So he's seen what works, what doesn't work, and understands that there's just not a one-size-fits-all, and is always interested in supporting the new things that emerge. I don't think he's afraid of that. I think he likes it.
Oh, that's interesting. I heard someone say the other day, community development and community development approaches evolve quite quickly. And yeah, I think this fits in quite well with, this is an approach to community development that we're trying out rather than the new approach or the one that's going to replace everything that's currently done.
I mean, when I first started in community development, the thing that was just lurking in the front of us was community-led development. So we hadn't had this idea of the community leading. And at that time, some of us doing community development said, well, it's just implicit. No, it's implicit. Yeah, that of course the community's leading, but it wasn't overt enough for people. And now there's this community-led approach, which I think makes a lot of sense when you're in government or in big NGOs. But when you're a resident in the street and people are talking to you about a community-led approach, it's kind of like it is what you're doing, so it doesn't speak so well. Like I was doing some community organising training in Lower Hutt with a group of residents, and I started introducing these community-led development principles, and I just had this moment where I thought, this makes no sense to them. Like, this is actually for the people that are working with the community, not for the people who are living in the community. And so, it's a great, community-led development principles are great guides for how we can do things. And participation culture will also be a great guide for how we can do things, but perhaps the emphasis is much more on, I hate to use this phrase, use it quotation marks, ordinary people, people with busy lives, people who are getting up, going to work, coming home, walking the dog, looking after their grandchildren. Like, what does it mean for them to be active in their community rather than a community-led, a group of people who are getting together to design a playground or to bring about complete change in their neighbourhood? I think that they all need to be there. I'm supportive of all of them, of everything.
Yeah, I think it's a big thing that I've found come up throughout this project is we heard it from Johnny Freeland talking, and we hear our weavers talking about it, and I think we talk about it, is that not the way, but a way, and just how I feel like that is a new age that we're moving into of not trying to find the next fad to replace the old, but to be able to grow our capacity within development approaches to be able to hold different processes, different ways in, different expressions of community development, and how do we grow our capacity as whether we're funders or community developers or people actually living in community to not be trying to just find that one way and get everyone on board with it.
That's a struggle sometimes, right? When you really believe in a way.
Yeah.
We're not competing, I think is what you're saying. We're not in a competitive environment where we're better or that's better. It's just a suite of things that you can choose from that perhaps suit the context you're in or the values that are important to you. I mean, I know the more work that I've done, the more I'm interested in the relationships that people have with each other. Even if I go right back to my very early community development experience, which was in Play Centre, and anyone who knows me knows how much I love Play Centre, I still have relationships from those people I went to Play Centre with, and they're not... we don't even have anything in common anymore. In fact, some of my Play Centre friends have very different views from me, but the years of working cooperatively together to put on early childhood sessions for our children have bonded us in a way where we know we can rely on each other. And I think that I'm interested in creating that in smaller place-based situations, in our street. In our street, do we know we don't have to be friends and making biscuits for each other, but do we know that we can knock on each other's door? Do we know that we can rely on each other? Do we know that there's enough relationship there so that when someone's pizza oven is blowing smoke into the next door neighbour's yard and all the washings getting smelly, that we can go and talk about it without that being the end of our relationship, without a negative vibe existing? I mean, that's what I'm particularly interested in. I think it's great I'm interested in that, and someone else is interested in a whole lot of people designing the park, and another person's interested in setting up, Pātaka Kai, all through the place. I think that's what we need, more of us interested in our own things, doing lots of them.
It sort of makes me think as well about insourcing rather than outsourcing. Like, just think about your example of the pizza oven is, I think there's been this growing culture within communities around outsourcing the problems to, we've got ring noise control or ring this council number and we'll get the authorities to come in and deal with this. Because we don't have that relationship there to be able to go and just say, hey man, can we have a chat about this? Like, and I think there's something about this idea of insourcing is like bringing that agency and that autonomy and that creativity in sort of back in, so it's emerging from inside the community rather than being outsourced.
And I love what you're saying. Like, I think the default is to ring noise control or ring the council, and I'm interested in what the social forces are that have created that as a response. Is it risk? Is it fear? Is it privacy? What do we think?
40 years of neoliberal government policy.
Say more about the neoliberal.
Well, so, I'm terrible at history, but my broad brush understanding is that in the 70s and 80s, government changed the way it did community development or funded community projects. So away from being what we might call today placemaking or, just funding the local community centre to be there because it was a good thing, to, well, now you have to have a contract and you have to tell us what your outcomes are, and we will contract you to deliver services for the community. And so that creates this real need to quantify and count everything and say, oh, well, this is this person's job and this is that person's job. And over time, it's created that real competition, because if you've got a contract with a community centre, you are invested in the government continuing to pay the community centre for your job. And so if anybody else comes along into the community and tries to do something, you're like, well, that might put my job at risk, or the contract from government. So it starts to create the competitiveness around funding and creates the us versus them dynamic, which leads to, reinforces that whole, oh, it's somebody else's job, or, the only way to make change is to get elected to the local board. Some people might argue the only way not to make change is to get elected to the local board.
Are you saying the ripple effects of that are that people in their houses are now looking to authority, or, as Lucy Mary's saying, outsourcing?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
I think one of the ripples, certainly not the only thing. The invention of the internet, but more generally the enabling of communities of identity or communities of interest rather than communities that are around you has created that clearer sense of who am I that's separate from these people around me, rather than, well, actually we've all got to pull the weeds and plant the wheat, otherwise none of us eat tomorrow, next year.
Because I think humanity or humanising systems and people is so important, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about in an unnamed place that I lived once. I had a next door neighbour where there was leakage on our lawn. Anyway, should we call the council? What should we do about this? And then I'm just going to go and bloody tell him. So I went and said something to him, and he was like, oh God, I'm sorry about that. My wife's just left me. Anyway, I ended up having this quite interpersonal and I felt different about him, because he had revealed stuff to me, and it didn't really matter anymore, the leaking pipe. I felt more about him on a human sense, and I feel like that's really missing, that there's nothing that encourages us to be human with each other, and maybe that's what this is about.
Totally. And I think you're right about that. We become so attached to our communities of identity, which we can totally engage with entirely virtually almost, or go off to another place, to a conference to attend. But it's those communities of place, right, that we do feel sort of dehumanized, because people are behind their fences, behind their gates, and if they want to connect with the outside world, there's lots of different channels. You can get your Uber Eats delivery, you can call noise control.
And this is that moment where we go, oh, we've got the theory in our head, oh, we need to humanise our neighbourhoods, we need to have people go out and connect with their neighbours, and then we say, and what's it like for us three sitting here talking? Do we do that? What stops us from doing that?
It's interesting you say that, because ever since doing this project, it's like this veil has been lifted off me that I realised was there, which was around this feeling of not feeling legitimate enough to go and initiate something in my neighbourhood, even though I had all these ideas. And, for me, I'm really passionate about ecology, and there's this bigger project of trying to regenerate a tui bird corridor from the Port Hills down into the central city of Christchurch. And I discovered that our suburb is within that corridor. And there was this feeling initially of, before I started this project, it was like, oh, I should wait to get permission from the Tui Corridor project and work with them to set something up. And then since doing this project, there was a feeling of like, no, the Tui Corridor is just a concept. I can bring this to life in my neighbourhood if I want to. I can start talking to people. I can just go and seed the idea and see if there's any excitement or interest in that. And it's like I didn't realise that veil was there until it lifted, and there was something about being in this project that's given me this feeling of like I'm allowed. I'm allowed to do this.
What about you, Duncan?
I've strongly identified with rainbow communities for many years and worked a lot in them, so it's hard to get out of that sense of identity. It's hard to get out of that connection to a community of identity and back into a community of place. I've also been inspired through this project in Neighbours Aotearoa over the years to coffee morning or whatever, and to say, come along, and then not be too concerned with how many people do or whether I've got permission. Or honestly, my biggest problem is probably finding a printer to print some notices and stick it in the elevator.
Yeah, I think we might have to have a watching space on me, because I've had this idea for 2.5 years now.
Party yet?
No, I've had this idea of a pizza party for 2.5 years, and let's
gone
see.
rather wrong, hasn't it, with some of your neighbours?
Yeah, Yeah. Let's see if by the end of this I've managed to have the pizza party or not. Yeah. Marie would say I'm starting too big, right? Going out for a pizza party is just too big to do something small, but
It's the bouncy castle effect.
everyone who knows me knows I like to go big. Matua, thank you for joining us. Next time we're going to be talking about mapping exercises and what they actually throw up.
So, on the ground.
Yeah, so join us then.
Ka kite.
Ka kite anō.
Thanks goes to 104.6 Planet FM Community Access Radio Auckland for their excellent recording studio and guidance in recording this podcast. The music is Pistoriosis by Shane Ivers of soundmanmusic.com. Mal Johannesson for bringing together draft episodes, Mish Maskell for their audio engineering expertise, and thanks to our interviewee, Marten Schievink, Senior Advisor at the Department of Internal Affairs.